Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We are thrilled to have Nishmat and the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy's great friend, Elliot Chodoff, here with us today to share his perspective on the current situation in Israel. I would like to say a few things about Elliot before we begin. Elliot is a reserve IDF major who has some particular skills, so particular that he's just been recalled to active duty for future service in the Gaza. First, he is a political and military analyst specializing in Middle East conflict and the global war on terrorism, which is not unlike saying Albert Einstein was a physicist. He has published and presented papers on deterrence, U.S. military manpower policy, cultural relativism and nuclear deterrence policy in the Middle East, Israel's changing defense posture following the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, terrorist use of modern information technology, and regional deterrence during and after the Cold War. His paper on combat motivation and the effectiveness in infantry units is an absolute favorite among U.S. Army officers who have attended the U.S. Army War College. And please trust me on this, class of 1993. His articles have appeared in the Washington Times, Washington Post, or National Post of Canada, and the National Interest, Front Page Magazine, and on many web journals. Elliot is the founder and senior editor of Mideast On Target, an online journal and newsletter. Elliot has lectured extensively on Middle Eastern conflict, terrorism, responses, military thought and strategy, the military aspects of international conflict, Arab-Israeli relations, and the sociology of modern Israel and the history of Zionism. He is a graduate of Home Front Command Senior Commander's course, commanded the Population Behavior and Information Unit of the Northern Region in the IDF Home Front Command, and served on active duty during the Second Lebanon War of 2006. He served at Gush Katif during the Gaza disengagement in 2005 and was a member of the rescue team after the 2004 bombing of the Taba Hilton on the Gulf of Aqaba. An expert in infantry weapons and tactics, he also taught fieldcraft and small unit tactics and operations to infantry and paratroop officers. In 2006, he received Homefront Command's Outstanding Officer Award. He and his son have decided to form a directed charity to equip reserve and needing IDF forces. This is very recent. My wife and I are certainly in, and Nishmat will certainly be a big supporter. And I will let him explain what he and Dove are doing at the end of his lectures. I do have two requests before we begin. First, would everyone please mute yourselves to avoid the inevitable open mic static and feedback? Second, please direct your questions for Elliot to Dr. David Patterson over the chat function on your Zoom app, and David will redirect your written questions to Elliot to keep things moving. Thank you all for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, live from our beloved state of Israel, Elliot Chodoff.
Thank you, Bill. In the time that I have, and with what's been going on for the past couple of weeks, if this talk were for 4 hours, I probably would be able to cover everything. So in the limited time, I want to hit a number of topics, and anybody who wants some expansion on that, feel free during Q&A. I want to talk about what happened, and to a certain extent why, on Shabbat Simchat Torah, October 7th. From the Israeli perspective. Then a bit about who the people were who did it, what is Hamas, and that's going to overlap with the first topic in terms of what were the misconceptions that allowed them to succeed as well as they did in those first hours. After that, where we are today, and that includes what's happening in the north. And I live up north, but tomorrow morning I'll be heading down south to Gaza. I was mobilized this afternoon. And I'll be heading down to the Gaza division. But if you're following the news, you know that the northern border is also not quiet. And what's happening there and why, and that'll include the American involvement as well, not just here, but sort of in general, because American involvement is critical to all of this. And last but not least, what it looks like is going to happen, with all of the caveats of trying to predict what will happen in warfare, but I want to also put it in the context of ethics, because that's certainly going to be a major issue in the days and the weeks to come. So to simply repeat what I'm sure all of you know, is 6:30 in the morning on Shabbat, Simchat Torah, October 7th, Hamas launched a massive offensive into southern Israel. We're still not 100% sure, but somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 terrorists came across in that first hour. They overran military bases, kibbutzim, moshavim. They entered towns like Sderot and Ofakim, and of course attacked the dance trance party, the peace party that was going on outside of Kibbutz Be'eri. Now, from the Israeli perspective, and there's no other way to describe it, this was, in my opinion, the worst military failure the IDF has suffered in its history. A great deal is being made about the intelligence failure, and I want to say, first of all, I'm not an intelligence officer. I've subordinates who for years have claimed that I'm not an intelligent officer, but that's a whole different question. But I'm a consumer of intelligence, not a producer. And as such, I put a great deal of weight into intelligence reports and projections, and I have a lot of respect for intelligence officers, mine and others over the years. But in this particular case, the intelligence failure was not critical in the disaster of what happened. Now, I want to explain that for a moment, because we're going to be hearing a lot about it. I'm going to certainly be hearing a lot about it after it's all over, when all the recriminations begin. There was an intelligence failure. And since it happened on the Gregorian date, one day after the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War 50 years earlier, it was an almost automatic parallel of the intelligence failure of 1973 and the intelligence failure of 2020. There's one huge difference. The failure of 1973 of Yom Kippur prevented the call-up of reserves prior to the outbreak of the war. In other words, the forces that faced the Syrian and Egyptian onslaught were the regular army forces, and they were simply quantitatively inadequate based on what was thrown at them. And just simple numbers. On the Golan Heights, the Israeli forces were outnumbered in tanks on the order of 10 to 1. 10 to 1 Syrian tanks to Israeli tanks. And on the Suez Canal, it was even worse. There were 436 Israeli soldiers on the Suez Canal when the first 20,000 Egyptians started crossing. So the failure to call up reserves there was critical. It led to the disaster of the first few days of the war. In contrast, the Gaza division that holds the line, which numbers nominally 10,000 troops, should have been able to stop this terrorist onslaught. Now, would they have stopped it hands down? Would have they prevented everything? Possibly not. But frankly, most of it would have been stopped in its tracks. The ultralight hang gliders, in my opinion, would have been a turkey shoot. A few of them might have gotten through. They would have done what terrorists do, but it would have been a total disaster for the terrorists. Now, however, they knew that the Gaza division was stripped down to below its nominal strength, number one, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything other than not following their own orders. And let me be clear on this. There are people saying, well, it's because they moved forces to the West Bank to protect the settlements and because of the intelligence failure. There's a basic standing rule. Forces in the line cannot go below a certain number. And if they're drawn below that number, The commander of that unit, in this case, the commander of the Gaza division, should have said, I will not violate my own standing orders. And if he receives it as an order from above, if he has any integrity, he says, I resign. But that's not what he did. And that's not what they did, because they didn't believe the threat. And here, let me say parenthetically, they didn't believe it in part because they said, oh, they wouldn't dare. Let me tell you that virtually every strategic surprise in history has been preceded by the side that was surprised saying they wouldn't dare. The Japanese wouldn't dare attack Pearl Harbor. The Germans wouldn't dare invade Russia. Al-Qaeda wouldn't dare attack the World Trade Center again. The Syrians and Egyptians wouldn't dare attack us on Yom Kippur. Well, they dare. And in this case, they dared as well. An underlying cause of this failure was an over-reliance on technology. And here I have to tell you, full disclosure, I am devoutly low-tech. I still navigate with the sun, the moon, and the stars. Compass on a bad day. It never fails. Reliance on technology basically takes the human element out. And I will tell you with the certainty of someone who's both experienced it for decades and studied it for decades, there has not yet been designed the technology that will stop a determined human being. The only thing that stops a determined human being is a better trained, more determined human being on the other side. And what happened here was classic. We built this huge barrier that was the smartest smart fence ever built in a world of smart fences at the cost of over $1 billion, and they knocked it down with tractors. It was backed up by an automatic firing system because we don't want to risk our troops. An automatic firing system that in Hebrew is called ro'eh yoreh. It had sensors and communications devices and remote control systems, and anything that came near the fence, it would lock onto and destroy. Except that the terrorists decided they could take it out with a drone attack using drones that you could probably order from AliExpress or Best Buy for about $10 a piece. And they simply dropped explosives from these drones on the sensors of the sophisticated system and knocked it out entirely. We had an extensive camera system. They shot out the cameras with snipers. And this tremendous sophisticated technological system failed in the first 5 minutes of the Hamas operation. There were no troops on the ground to stop them. And with that, they flooded into southern Israel. It was well planned. I don't want to go into all the details of the attack. A lot of it is out there and online. It was a combined attack with rockets. They came in on vehicles, using pickup trucks, motorcycles, ultralight hang gliders, and on foot. They scattered around the area. They took, as I said, both military bases and kibbutzim, moshavim, and held on to towns. The Sderot police station, anybody who over the past couple of decades has been to Sderot to see the rocket collection, that was the police station. That police station doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed in the fighting. And of course, they committed atrocities beyond the imagination of good people. Now here I have to tell you, I've been watching these guys for many, many years. I'm not one of the good people. Nothing they did surprised me because nothing they did was qualitatively different from anything they've done before. Quantitatively, it was. In other words, they did much more of it. But murdering children in their beds, they've done. Murdering children in car seats of cars after they've shot a parent driving and the car pulls over to the side of the road. Let me say that to this day, we're over 2 weeks after the event. Hundreds of bodies are still unidentified because they are visually unrecognizable. And I won't go on to in any more graphics. I think you've gotten the picture. I have to tell you, I've spent the last 2 weeks going through all the videos I get my hands on, ours and theirs. and not because I get any thrill out of watching it, but an attempt to learn the lessons of what I can see. And of course, you don't know what you're going to see until you've seen it. The director of American National Security, Admiral Kirby, who was one of the leaders of America's war against ISIS, broke down in tears in his first briefing. And after he visited here and saw even more evidence, he said, I fought ISIS and never saw anything as horrendous as what I'm seeing now. That's Hamas. There's a silver lining to this, and it's a very, very thin silver lining. Hamas planned on taking even more ground than they took, more towns than they took, and they planned to hold out from anywhere between 30 and 90 days in some of these places, continuing their rampage, holding hostages, and the like. And I'll come back to the hostages in a moment. In fact, once the Israeli army got its act together, within about 24 hours, the entire Hamas attack had been shut down. Virtually all of them were either killed or captured or had escaped back to Gaza. And I can tell you that there's an operation now underway with the Shabak, the Shin Bet, and the Israeli military to locate, we've already identified virtually all of them, to locate and eliminate every single Hamas terrorist who took part in the attack of October 7th. But by Sunday evening, we had basically regained control of everything except for 2 or 3 locations in Israel where they were holding hostages. And of course, that slowed down the response. In all of those locations, ultimately the hostages were freed and the terrorists were either killed or captured. I say killed or captured because the captured part is very, very important here. And I've spoken to some groups, why don't you just kill them all? Because a captured terrorist is a gift that keeps on giving. We are taking out targets today that we didn't know existed before we captured these people. In other words, there's a constant move. We're getting more and more information and acting on it. And that's working very much to the benefit of the military operation. Of course, on top of everything else, they took, our official number now is over 200. It's my personal belief that that number is really higher. And not because I know better, simply because the official number can only be the number of confirmed, but there's still about 100 people who are considered missing. And if they're missing, you can't categorize them as anything other than missing until you know for sure. Now, I don't believe that every single one of them is being held hostage, but some of them are. So whatever the official number is, you can assume that it's higher than that. And of course, it includes men, women, children, babies whose parents were murdered, elderly, Holocaust survivors. In other words, these people, in their brutality, have basically checked off every single box of inhumanity that exists. We started a bombing campaign. First of all, we started by saying we're at war. This is the first time we've done that officially since 1973. Everything up until now, whether it was in Lebanon or in Gaza or in the West Bank, has always been an operation around, some euphemism, but never war. And war has certain legal ramifications, both here and in terms of the international community. We said, we're at war. That's it. There's a meme that's going around on social media that I think is very apt. It shows an area of Gaza that we've bombed, and the meme says, we're not doing this to teach you a lesson. We're doing it because we learned ours. The Israeli government, over the years, made a perfectly understandable, fatal mistake. They believed that they could manage evil. They believed that despite all of Hamas's statements and all of its declarations and everything that is written in its charter about destroying Israel and annihilating the Jews, we could really get them to calm down by offering them work permits and allowing a little bit more in terms of goods and services into Gaza. And here I have to tell you, David has read stuff that I've written that's not published. I've written and studied this. When terrorist organizations behave as Hamas had over the years, it was never for the benefit of their own population. It was always in order to improve their chances and their capabilities to do what Hamas did 2 weeks ago. But you know what? We're good people. We'd like to believe that people are not completely evil. It's hard for us to comprehend evil. It just is. It's hard to get your head around evil. And this was the attempt that was failed and paid for in untold gallons of Jewish blood. With that, we are now geared up to go into Gaza on the ground. The mission is to destroy Hamas. Now, there's been all sorts of stuff coming out from all sorts of different places, and I don't want to cite them, but I'm sure you've seen. You can't destroy Hamas. As a matter of fact, there was an article in Foreign Affairs the other day. You can't destroy Hamas. Hamas is an idea. This is simply not true. You cannot destroy radical Islam as an idea, but you can certainly destroy Hamas as an organization. And I will give you an apt parallel. In May 1945, the Allies destroyed Nazi Germany. They didn't destroy Nazism, as we well know, because it's still alive and well. But Nazi Germany was destroyed. Hamas can be destroyed, and the army's mission that it's being given is to destroy Hamas. And that means going in on the ground, and we've made very clear the way we did it in the past is not going to be the way we're doing it this time around. And with that, before I shift into the ethics, I want to talk about a little bit of what's going on sort of around us, and I'm going to start with the United States. And I'm not going to go into American politics, and some of you have heard me speak before, and you may have heard me say this. Worth repeating if you've heard it, and worth saying if you haven't heard it. I am an honor graduate of the Israeli Army Mines and Demolitions course. And the first thing they teach you is do not walk into a minefield. I'm not talking about American politics. American politics is a minefield that I'm simply not going to walk into, but I will talk about American policy. And here, let me say that up until this point, and I'm not going to project because some of it is already changing, but up until this point, the Biden administration has been the most Israel supportive administration during crisis of any American administration in Israel's history. President Biden's speech had all of the right words in it, and I'll tell you exactly what they were, and I listened very closely to this because, among other things, I've studied international relations. He did not say that Israel has the right to defend itself. By the way, that term in and of itself is almost anti-Semitic. What do you mean you tell me I have the right to defend myself? It's as if it's conditional. But many people do, and they think they're saying a nice thing by saying it. We believe that Israel has the right to defend itself. That is not what the president said. He said Israel has the obligation to respond to this attack. Obligation to respond are two completely different terms from right to defend. He also, very importantly, did not use the word restraint. Critically important. And I know he was criticized for not calling out Iran by name, which he did the next day. But when he said, I have a message to any country or organization that wants to take advantage of this situation, I have one word to say to you: don't. Anybody who thinks that the country and organization that he was referring to were Peru and the Boy Scouts of America doesn't understand what he was saying. The country was Iran, and the organization was Hezbollah. And to back it up, 2 U.S. carrier task forces were sent into the Eastern Mediterranean. One is here, one is on the way. One ship, the Carney, that's part of the Gerald Ford Battle Group, has already engaged and intercepted cruise missiles and drones fired by the Houthis of Yemen in a 9-hour operation, taking them out on the way to Israel. Now, between us, I think that our air defense would have taken them out anyway, but that doesn't matter. America showed that it is in this and willing to do it now. And there's also been a huge aid package, supplies coming in, and the like. Am I happy with every single aspect? No, I think there's a bit of a bear hug to prevent us from doing certain things. There have been insistence on things like aid to Gaza, which we preferred not to do as long as they're holding hostages. I'm not going to give it an absolute perfect score. But in the overall, absolutely so far, as good as it's going to get, better than anything that ever has been before in terms of openness and preparedness. And that is one of the factors, not the only one of the factors that's keeping Iran and Hezbollah on the periphery and not in the center of this. Another factor is that they all made a huge mistake. And it was a mistake that was rather obvious very early on. As I'm sure you know, that Israel's been going through a very difficult internal period of dispute and strife over the government's judicial reform plan and the way they're doing it. And I don't want to go into the details of that, but huge demonstrations, calls for resignation of the government, overthrow of the government in democratic terms, but get rid of the government, people saying they weren't going to serve in the military, pilots saying they weren't going to serve. And when Iran looks at something like that, and I'm not saying this was the cause, because they've been planning this for well over a year. And let nobody think this was, they woke up 2 weeks ago and started. This is well over a year in planning. But one of the things that they believe now, and Iran could only see this through their own eyes, if that level of demonstration had been going on, and that nature of demonstration had been going on in Iran for months, and an attacker had struck the country under the circumstances, the Iranian government knows that the opposition, the demonstrators, would use that as a lever to overthrow the regime. And they believe, under the best of circumstances from their point of view, that would happen in Israel. And under the worst of circumstances, the divisiveness within the country would prevent a decisive response against the attack and possibly against an additional attack by Hezbollah. Saturday morning, as I mentioned, the attack started around 6:30 in the morning. By 10:30 in the morning, the leaders of the protest movement basically said this is all on hold until it's over. In other words, that's it. Protest period is done. Now we all have to get together. And they made a public call. Anybody who gets called up for reserve duty goes. No protest, no refusal, no game playing. Here we are. In other words, Israel became more unified by midday Saturday, October 7th, than it has been in years. And I think that Hezbollah and Iran took one look at that and said, oops, mistake, time to back down a little bit. Now, Hezbollah has been doing all sorts of stuff along our border every day. We've been responding heavily, and they're not escalating. Now, I'm not going to say that they're not going in. The Middle East is way too volatile to make those kind of predictions. So I'll put it this way. If I had to bet, sitting where I am at the moment, I would bet that they won't, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. I think the odds are that they won't, but not usually so. And anything can happen here that can change that. But at the moment, that's what I see. And now, last but not least, I'm not going to go into what we're going to do in Gaza because, frankly, it's not a fair discussion. What I know, I can't tell you, and the rest I don't know, and I wouldn't be able to tell you. But I will say this. There's been an attempt, and this is also true from the American administration, to differentiate between the population of Gaza and Hamas. Our war is with Hamas and not with the population of Gaza. There are a few problems with this. First of all, Hamas was elected by the population of Gaza. They got a very strong majority. Now, it's true, the elections were in 2006, and they haven't been held since. But they got a very strong majority, and all public opinion polling since then shows that Hamas would get more votes today, as of 2.5 weeks ago, than they even got in 2006. Witness the population in the streets when the terrorists came back on the 7th with the hostages. The population wasn't opposed to it. The streets weren't empty with the population saying, "Oh my God, what have you done? We don't want to have any part of this." The streets were packed with crowds that were celebrating. It was beyond celebrating. The terrorists, in some cases, had to protect the hostages from being lynched by the crowds. Now, am I going to tell you that every single last resident of Gaza is a supporter of Hamas? No, I won't tell you that. But the overwhelming majority of the population supported what they did, celebrated what they did, and they were 100% behind what they did right up until the Israeli airstrikes began. Now, all of a sudden, they're all innocent. We are going into what is going to be, by definition, a messy ground campaign. It's going to be urban warfare. We've told the population to evacuate. Hundreds of thousands have. Some have not. Some are being prevented by Hamas. A number were killed trying to evacuate. Hamas has made it very clear they don't want all the human shields disappearing on them. And with that, we need to go in understanding the basic ethics of warfare as delineated essentially in two bodies. One is the Fourth Geneva Convention. What does the Geneva Convention say about civilians in war? And something that's called just war theory, and the two are related. Neither the Geneva Convention nor just war theory say that civilian casualties are by definition a war crime. On the contrary, they both say the same thing. The presence of civilians around military targets, or I'll reverse it, the presence of military targets in areas where there are civilians endangers the civilians, does not protect the military target. In other words, both the law and the ethics say you don't not strike a military target because there are civilians there. They shouldn't have put it there in the first place, or they should have moved the civilians out. Do everything you can not to endanger civilians. Certainly do not target civilians, but their presence in and of itself does not prevent an attack. The laws or the ethics of just war basically fall into two grand categories. One is the ethics of the war itself. In other words, is the war ethical? Are the purposes ethical? Is the context ethical? And the second, is it being carried out in an ethical way? So just to give you a hypothetical situation, even if one believes that Hamas has the ethical right to attack Israel, which I don't, but even if one believes that Hamas has the ethical right to attack Israel, what they did 2 weeks ago violates all the rules of ethics and warfare. Israel's response at this point is the height of ethics. We're going against an organization that is genocidal by declaration and by action. Their words and their actions coincide 100%. Now, here again, both international law and ethics say if your cause is ethical, then victory is also ethical. In other words, you need to win. And victory becomes an ethical basis of the war. You don't lose an ethical war for other sorts of reasons. What do? You try to get non-combatants to evacuate, which is exactly what Israel did over the past week, and was condemned by the United Nations for doing it. You leave corridors for civilians, for non-combatants to evacuate. Exactly what Israel did, and was condemned by the UN for it. You do the best you possibly can to make your targets as focused militarily as possible, keeping in mind that munitions are not that precise and they are not that discriminating in the sense that when something explodes, like a missile or a bomb, you cannot control everything that it does. But you know what? Given the magnitude of the Israeli strikes over the past couple of weeks, and given that many of the people killed were terrorists who we were trying to kill, the civilian casualty ratio is extremely low. The United States of America, which I consider to be a highly ethical country in warfare, now, of course, there aren't a lot of other countries that you can measure yourself against. Russia doesn't, fall into the same category. By the way, Putin last week condemned Israel for civilian casualties, and the Chancellor of Germany said it was the most cynical thing he ever heard in his life. Putin is condemning someone for civilian casualties after what's been going on in Ukraine. The casualty numbers that America considers to be acceptable of non-combatants to combatants in aerial warfare and in major ground warfare is something on the order of 20 or 30 to 1. In other words, for every terrorist killed, 20 civilians being killed is considered to be acceptable damage as long as it wasn't intentional. I will tell you that up until now in Gaza, the ratio is less than 1 to 1. And that's near miraculous. But it's a credit to the precision targeting and execution of the Israeli Air Force and some of the ground forces, because we're operating there on the ground as well at something of a distance. We haven't gone in fully. Last but not least, no matter what we do, as we saw this past week, we are going to be condemned. And I think the hospital event that we saw this week was about as classic as it can get. Islamic Jihad fired a rocket aimed at Israel. It went off course. It hit, and within 5 minutes, Hamas declared that an Israeli bomb had hit a hospital and killed 500 people, and the Western press uniformly reported Israel bombs hospital in Gaza and kills 500 people. Now, that Hamas lies is not even worth discussing. But what is interesting is not just that the press bought the Hamas lie. It's that the press bought a lie that they knew had to be a lie. They knew it, that it had to be a lie, because anybody who knows anything about disasters, whether they be military or natural, knows that in the first 5 minutes after an event, you don't know how many casualties there are. By the way, I'll give you a rule of thumb that I know from my experience. Earthquakes happen. God forbid, but they happen. Whatever initial number is announced, you can assume that the real number is about 10 times that. It's a fact. Within minutes, they said 500, and within minutes, the media was parroting 500. And the condemnations began. And of course, the condemnations from Iran and Qatar and China and Russia don't interest me. But Canada? From certain members of the American Congress who should remain nameless, doesn't surprise me. But others chimed in as well. And then to add insult to injury, when Israel did what we would expect a country like Israel to do, which is to say, you know what, we're going to check it out and we'll get back to you as soon as we are absolutely sure that we understand what happened, which took about 5 hours. The headline said, Israel and Hamas dispute origin of missile, as if Israel and Hamas are kind of equal sources in the world. And that headline remained for close to 24 hours. Until President Biden came in and said, yeah, I saw all the stuff. And what did he say? It looks like it was the other team. And then they started backing down. We need to be aware of this because there will be things happening over the next weeks where we will be responsible, not by intent, but by result. It'll be a war. And Israel's going to be roundly condemned for it on levels that are unprecedented. It's easy to be influenced by it. In other words, we watch something and say, oh, Israel made a mistake and did this, and say, oh, how could they do such a thing? So I'll conclude with this idea. Trust me on this. When they're shooting at you, your precision goes down, your decision-making judgment is not as nice and clean as it is sitting as we are right now in our living rooms or offices or family rooms, and you make mistakes. Israel is going to be condemned for those mistakes as if they were intended from the outset, and we already see the condemnation of Israeli genocide out there. So something we should be aware of going in. I'm going to stop here. I just want to say a few words about this initiative that I started a few days ago. So understand that it's a few days ago, and the details are still being worked out. When I started, I didn't know that I was going to be called up. I'm leaving for the Army tomorrow morning, Israel time. I'll be going to the Gaza division. I'll be there tomorrow. So for the duration, basically. But the idea was basically this. There are all sorts of calls going around in all sorts of WhatsApp groups in Israel by relatives of soldiers, whether it's parents or siblings or spouses of regular and reserve units that have been called up. Let's keep in mind that Israel's mobilized, some 400,000 reservists in the fastest reserve call-up in Israel's history. Under the best of circumstances, logistics never reach what you would like them to be. Under these circumstances, logistics haven't even caught up yet. And they're beginning to understand what they don't have by a combination of what logistics is not providing. And all of a sudden, what seemed to be theoretical a month ago is now very, 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 very real. And what I've started doing is a recipient-based initiative. In other words, instead of saying, oh, let's go buy a bunch of whatever and send them to Israel and see who needs them, where I can tell you with some knowledge and certainty, some of that stuff is not going to end up anywhere, because if you don't have an address, it'll get lost in the sauce, not out of malice, just by the nature of the beast. Where instead, it went up and I got to the unit and I got a request from a reserve unit, infantry unit, that needed 30 battle vests. This was this past Tuesday. They had found a place to get them, but they didn't have the funds for it. Tuesday afternoon, they made contact with me. Tuesday evening, we had the funds and it was paid for. And Wednesday morning, the battle vests were at the unit. That's the idea of recipient-based. This afternoon, somebody arrived from the U.S. with a package for a regular infantry battalion that, again, they made contact with me. In this case, it was on Thursday, which was kind of tight because of Shabbat. But still, we managed to acquire some of their list, get it to somebody who was flying on Saturday night. They landed this afternoon. On my way down to Gaza tomorrow, I'm going to pick it up and drop it off at the unit. And essentially what we're looking for is an as-needed response. In other words, we'll need funds for sure. We might need people to be able to go out and actually acquire the things. And by the way, I'm not talking about anything illegal here. I'm talking about Leathermans and watches, and what we just sent were emergency whistles, because when you go into now, we're concerned with soldiers being grabbed by Hamas, additional hostages, being able to call back and forth and let others know that you're in danger or okay, and that sort of thing. All sorts of ancillary equipment that becomes critical in battle that needs to be acquired, in some cases very, very quickly. We're also trying to develop means of getting them to Israel. My son Dov, who lives in Maryland, is sort of the center of this network. We're creating a network of networks, and Bill and Jerry have said they'd be interested in centralizing this one. But basically an on-call as needed that might include somebody saying, you know what, I can get to Cabela's and pick the stuff up today and get it to a certain location. We're arranging or organizing discount FedEx shipments, contacting people who are coming here who'll be willing to carry an extra suitcase or two, and if we have to pay the extra baggage charge will do that, and up to the extreme of paying somebody's ticket and loading them down with suitcases and flying them here. And I give that's sort of the gamut of what we've thought of. And if you've got, oh, and somebody even said, why don't you find somebody who's got a private plane and charter it from them? You know what? I rule nothing out. It's basically what I talked about with some people today is solving for simultaneous variables and coming to the optimum, the optimal solution to the equation. So if it sounds a little amorphous, it is. I think that's part of what's going to give it its strength. So if you're interested, Jerry and Bill will be the addresses from here. I'll stop there, and I'll be here for Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
thank you, Elliot. You certainly lived up to your billing, and we have several people with questions. We have a few people with questions concerning Iran.
Okay.
That's one. Juliana asks about, do you know anything about the Biden administration giving $10 billion to Iraq to be passed on to Iran?
That I hadn't heard of. I know about the $6 billion that was passed on recently.
Yeah.
And here let me say that $6 billion came too late for this. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I support the $6 billion was a disaster. It was a disaster, but it didn't have a direct impact on what happened 2 weeks ago. And I also want to say that American equipment left behind in Afghanistan also had nothing to do with what happened 2 weeks ago, because virtually all the weapons that we saw were Russian type weapons, either AK-47s or RPGs. I saw no case of American equipment being used by the terrorists. And that's something I watched.
And what about Iran?
They're behind it all.
Do you see a point where we're going to have to take out Iran?
I believe we will. The question is, who's we?
Yeah.
And what does take out mean? Israel doesn't have with the conventional capability to destroy Iran's infrastructure, let's say, military or civil. We can do damage. We've done damage. We've done it by cyber. We've done it by clandestine. But Iran is an extremely powerful country. It's an extremely large country. And let me just give you a sense of scale. The two aircraft carriers, task forces that America is sending to the Eastern Med, one that's here and one that's on its way, those two carriers have between them something on the order of 200 combat aircraft. The Israeli Air Force has something on the order of 700 combat aircraft. So try to get a sense of, Israel's very powerful, the Air Force is amazing, but it doesn't have the mass strategic capability to take on and take out a country.
Yeah. What do you see? Another question. I'm saying too early to tell, perhaps, but who will fill the vacuum that's left after Hamas is destroyed?
So there's all sorts of talk, and here I don't think anybody really knows. And I think that what happened 2 weeks ago was a paradigm shift for Israel in terms of that question. For years, we have said we don't want to eliminate Hamas because who knows what will come after them. If we take out Hamas, we may get ISIS in its place. And 2 weeks ago, we learned that Hamas and ISIS are basically synonymous. And the paradigm shift, I think, was take out Hamas because whatever comes in its place can't be worse. It might be just as bad, but it can't be worse. So if you do the sort of weighted scale analysis, it could be better. It might be the same. It can't be worse. Take them out. There's no argument against removing them, And even chaos is better than what we have now.
Yeah. Another question from this one from Grace. Many of us here in the U.S. know, Americans who are really not very much in support of Israel, and they're saying Hamas has a right to take such actions because Israel controls their water and electricity, and they can't leave Gaza. How should we answer our friends who raise such points?
Okay, so the first thing I would do is have them see the IDF spokesman's video that they put out a few days ago. And if you don't have the link, David, I'll send it to you. It's in Ynet did an article on it. The link is there. It's a YouTube link. I suggest watching it only if you have a strong stomach, because it's a pretty much unedited series of clips from security cameras from the Israeli towns and body and dash cams from the terrorists. And it's very, very difficult to watch. But that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, wait a minute. We are providing them with water, and we don't have the right to stop providing them with water. Why do I have to provide them with water? Why do I have to provide them with gasoline? Why do I have to provide them with electricity? And by the way, the electricity story is a classic Hamas-Israel story, because there's an electric plant in Ashkelon inside of Gaza that provides them with electricity. They have fired rockets at that electric plant. And I mean in the past. There were times during the exchanges of fighting in the past where Hamas rockets took out the high tension lines that bring the electricity from our power plant to Gaza. And the UN condemned us for cutting off their electricity. Now, I don't know any rule of law, ethics, humanitarianism that says that I need to provide somebody with electricity when they're shooting at me.
Yeah.
And the idea and terminology matters here. I've heard a lot of people say Israel cut off Gaza's electricity. We didn't cut off their electricity. We just stopped providing it. Let them provide their own instead of building terrorist tunnels and rockets.
Yeah, well, they could be independent that way. They could be autonomous. I have a couple of questions concerning weapons, use of weapons from
Yes.
Neva. One, she's saying that she wants to know, is there any truth, as we see in social media, that Israel uses white phosphorus?
Yes, Israel uses white phosphorus, but not as a munition. White phosphorus is used for two things in warfare. One is for illumination, and the other is for marking a target. In other words, it's not fired as a munition into the target. It's fired as a marker above the target. And since it hangs in the air and burns for quite a while, it allows for zeroing of targeting both from the air and from the ground. And by the way, under those circumstances, its use is perfectly legal according to the laws of war.
And what about the tunnels? What kind of measures or weapons do you see being used to deal with the tunnels? Do you see the use of gas?
No.
Before sending soldiers in or anything?
I don't see the use of gas. I know that we're flooding some of them. We are also bombing some of them because, in particular, as we interrogate prisoners and find out where the tunnels run, direct hits on the tunnels cause them to collapse. By the way, many of them are both partially under the foundations of buildings, so the collapse of a tunnel can bring a building down. Yeah. And also many of them are packed with munitions. And for those who are not familiar, munitions explode by something that's called sympathetic detonation, which means that if you set off an explosive that is in some contact, and it doesn't have to be adjacent, it doesn't have to be physically next to, but in some contact with another cache of explosives, that one can explode as well. And if there's another one down the line in the tunnel, it can cause that one to explode as well. And we've seen that effect where we've bombed one target and suddenly a whole bunch of others blocks away start blowing up, including mosques, as it turns out. So these are effects of our going after the tunnels. I find it unlikely that we're going to go into the tunnels in simple, straightforward infantry, but engineers know how to deal with them. High explosives work very well, and there are ways of dealing with the tunnels. There are techniques that don't include sending one guy first and waiting for him to get shot.
Yes, here's maybe one or two more questions, and here's a question that I have thought about myself. I mean, and you and I have talked a lot about these things for many years.
Yes.
I'm wondering, I'm thinking, in fact, that Fatah, PLO, the Palestinian Authority, wouldn't be so terribly upset if the Israelis took out Hamas in Gaza.
Correct.
I think they see it as a possible opening to them.
Yes, but they're caught on the horns of a dilemma.
Yeah.
Because they don't want Hamas to become a symbol of heroism, even in defeat.
Right.
And we're beginning to see some of this in the West Bank as well, where Fatah is starting operations in order to show that they're in the game as well, because Hamas is accusing them of cowardice for not being part of it. So they're walking a fine tightrope. Too bad about them. Somewhere between wanting to see Hamas eliminated, but not wanting to see Hamas elevated in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Hamas has operatives in the West Bank. Yes,
many. One of the great myths is that Hamas is in Gaza and not in the West Bank. Hamas is very heavily represented in some areas of the West Bank, Jenin in particular, right. Hebron, Tulkarem, parts of Shechem. They're there for sure.
One more question. You have another 2-3 minutes.
Go.
It's actually from one of my students about the press. I mean, let you see, as you pointed out, the press seems to jump all over. A news story like Israelis bomb and hospital and kill 500 people, and not just here and there.
Right.
It seems to be a part of the media culture somehow. Do you have any thoughts on what's driving that, where that's coming from?
It's easy to say anti-Semitism, and I'm more and more inclined to say it now than I have been over the years, because I'm hard pressed to find other reasons, and I used to find other reasons and give them the benefit of the doubt. But I'll tell you, this past hospital event, not only did the press just go anti-Israel, not only did they violate their own as if standards of journalism, what they did was actually counterproductive from a journalistic point of view. Because what they should have said in the initial reports was, explosion occurs in Gaza hospital, many casualties reported, stay tuned for this breaking story.
Right.
When instead they said, Israeli strike hits Gaza hospital, kills 500, which in effect ends the story.
Right. Well, and it aids and abets Hamas.
For sure. What I'm saying is that the aiding and abetting Hamas actually took precedence not only over the journalistic values and ethics, if there are such a thing, but the commercial aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as we all know, the real purpose of the news media is to make money, and the way they do it is to keep you hooked on the story. And the way they keep you hooked on the story is by feeding you tidbits periodically and telling you to stay tuned and we're on this and stay tuned. And here they basically did the exact opposite.
Well, it looks like bashing Israel can be profitable then.
It's profitable. It feels good apparently to them.
Yeah.
BBC giving the order, refusing to use the word terrorist in reference to Hamas,
Right.
etc.
Okay. Thanks so much, Elliot. Bill, are you still there?
Make it
Bill.
big, the whole screen.
Yeah. Bill, do you have a parting word for us?
Elliot, unbelievably wonderful and informative. Thank you, my brother. Godspeed to you, and be safe out there.
Thank
Do
you.
our work for us in God's work. And may God bless you always, my friend. I unfortunately have got to unplug and go to a baby naming, which is what Jews do in time like this. And so I will go do that, and you go do what you do, and I will catch
Thank
up
you.
with you when we can.
Absolutely.
All right, my brother. We
Yeah,
love you.
Elliot.
Take care of yourself.
Take care.
Be careful, okay?
Tell them to be careful.
I'm not worried about Elliot. If I was Hamas, I'd be very worried.
There's the predator and the prey, and we know who the predator is in this case.
Yeah.
So,
Oh yes.
I mean,
Elliot,
Yes.
I just left a message before we go, but just so that you hear it from me directly here. My name is Rabbi David Barnett. I'm the new rabbi here to be joining the Congregation Nishmat Am family. And on behalf of all of us, I would just like to thank you so much for your excellence, your insight, your expertise that you so passionately feel and have been committed to with your life. And this is absolutely something that is so important for all of us. And each and every one of us, I know, hung on every single word you said, and it'll give us a tremendous amount of material to hash over. And may God just protect you, in every aspect of what you do to support our country and the state of Israel. Absolutely.
Thank you.
thank you.